Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever found yourself drawn to someone in a way that just doesn't quite make logical sense, almost overriding your rational instincts?
That's sort of a primal pull.
Exactly. Today we're plunging into, well, a truly unsettling question our material raises. How do some forms of connection seem to bypass the adult mind entirely and whisper to something much, much older within us?
Yeah, and our core mission today is really to illuminate the mechanics of what's known as psychological regression, specifically in the context of seduction. And let me be really clear here. This isn't about celebrating manipulation at all.
Right.
This is intended as a critical warning. The goal is to empower you, our listener, to recognize these patterns, not just in others who might try to, exert undue influence, but maybe, if you look closely, even within yourself sometime.
That self-reflection piece is key.
Definitely. Understand that these dynamics is really the first step towards safeguarding your autonomy.
That's a powerful intention for this deep dive. And the anonymous reflection we found in the material, it truly hits home. I think it's a perfect launching point for what we're about to unpack. It says, man is not a rational creature. He is a bundle of instincts, wounds, memories, and needs. Seduction does not appeal to the adult in him. It whispers to the child within. That quote, it just forces us to rethink what seduction even means, doesn't it? What, in your view, is the most crucial part of that for listeners to really grasp?
I think the most crucial part is exactly that phrase, whispering to the child within. It's all about bypassing the logical, mature adult self. Our sources reveal how truly skilled seductive personalities exploit those very cracks.
Those vulnerabilities.
Precisely. Those unhealed parts from childhood, maybe past trauma, or just deeply unmet desires. It's a descent into what one of our sources actually called the psychological underworld.
Wow.
Yeah, where vulnerability isn't just seen, it's weaponized.
A descent into the underworld. Okay, that definitely sets the tone. So let's begin our exploration into this fascinating, albeit quite dark, territory. Our research outlined four really potent types of psychological regression that can be exploited by manipulative seducers. Let's start with the emotional aspect, because that often feels like the very first crack in the foundation.
Indeed. The first type is emotional regression. We've kind of termed it the inner child's silent cry. So when we talk about emotional regression, we're referring to an unconscious return to younger emotional states. This often happens when someone's under significant stress, maybe emotional overload, or perhaps facing overwhelming rejection.
Right.
You might see it manifest in these, reactive childlike ways, sulking, crying, maybe clinging, fits of rage even, or just an inexplicable, overwhelming need for comfort without a clear, rational adult reason. It's like the adult has quite literally left the room.
Okay, so if the adult isn't present, that's exactly when a seducer steps in, isn't it?
Yeah.
But hang on, first, why does our mind even go there when we're adults? What's the underlying mechanism?
Well, it connects back to our inherent emotional fragility and, let's face it, our imperfect childhoods. We all carry unaddressed needs or hurts from our past, right? So when we're emotionally overwhelmed in adulthood, maybe by rejection or loss or humiliation, our minds can instinctively regress. They go back to the emotional coping mechanisms we learned as a younger self.
Ah, okay.
In that moment, we're no longer responding as a rational adult. We're reacting as, a wounded child, seeking the comfort or validation we might have lacked back then.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so in practical terms, how does this unconscious return to younger emotional states actually look in a day-to-day interaction? And how does a manipulator spot it and exploit it?
Well, a master seducer, they watch for those really subtle signs. They pay incredibly close attention to micro-expressions, shifts in your voice, maybe moments of irrational defensiveness, or those vulnerable confessions you might let slip.
Tiny tells.
Exactly. They understand that when you're emotionally regressed, the adult isn't really in charge anymore. The child that remains is often desperate for comfort, for attention, for rescue. So the seducer steps in, but not with logic, right? They step in with profound soothing. They effectively become the safe parent or the ideal caretaker, whispering phrases like, you deserve so much more, or you shouldn't have to feel this way, or maybe even, I understand you better than anyone else ever could.
Oh, that's manipulative.
It is. And the regressed person, who's desperate for relief, then bonds with them as if they're a literal lifeline. And very, very soon, they need them. Not just want, but need.
That idea of being needed as a lifeline, not genuinely desired, that's chilling. What's the ultimate danger for the person being rescued in this scenario? What's the fallout?
The danger is profound. You are binding them through dependency. not genuine desire or connection. You're not truly touching their heart. You are, in essence, kind of puppeteering their trauma.
Wow.
And while it might give the seducer a sense of power in the short term, this creates an incredibly volatile emotional bond. It's unstable. The person will idolize you one moment, then potentially resent or even hate you the next, because deep down, they know they're trapped in this state of primal need.
Right, it's not freely chosen.
Exactly. This form of regression-based connection makes love obsessive. And obsession, as our sources constantly warn, always ends badly, either in destruction or complete collapse. It's a powerful but incredibly dangerous position for both parties involved, really.
That warning about dependency is incredibly clear. So, okay, if emotional vulnerability is one major entry point, where do we go next in understanding these tactics? What's the next layer of this psychological onion we're peeling?
That brings us to the second type, behavioral regression. This is basically when adults start acting like children in their actions. This type is characterized by a return to earlier behavioral habits, often immature, sometimes helpless, or even compulsive behaviors, especially when someone is stressed or feeling emotionally destabilized.
Okay.
You'll see it manifest as things like whining or passive aggressiveness, overwhelming neediness, maybe impulsivity, or even really subtle physical gestures like slouching, fidgeting constantly, avoiding eye contact.
Yeah, I think I've seen this, maybe even felt it myself in moments of extreme stress, you know? Why do we revert to these specific, often less effective behaviors? Like, why whining?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The human psyche, it basically stores these behavioral coping mechanisms from childhood. Many of them were developed as survival responses, ways to navigate a confusing world when we were small and didn't have adult tools.
Right, like getting attention or avoiding conflict.
Precisely. So when adult stress becomes too much, when it overloads a person's capacity to function rationally, they often revert to these automatic behaviors because they represent a kind of safe emotional blueprint, something familiar. The rational adult part of the brain effectively shuts down, and the body and instincts take over in this almost frantic search for comfort or control.
That's a really clear explanation. So how do seducers specifically exploit these ingrained, almost automatic behavioral shifts? Do they just wait for someone to crack, or do they actively trigger it?
Oh, this is where the cautionary tone really deepens. Because a manipulative seducer knows that stress, confusion, and fear don't make people think clearly. They make people regress. So they don't just wait for it. They often deliberately destabilize their target.
How? How do they do that?
They might employ hot-cold behavior, intensely affectionate one minute, distant and dismissive the next. This creates huge psychological ambiguity.
Right, keeps you guessing.
Exactly. Or they might intentionally create jealousy or competition. They might withhold validation precisely when you seek it, actively triggering your deepest insecurities. They can even mirror your own fears back to you, amplifying them until you feel completely adrift and unsure of yourself.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And as the target regresses behaviorally, they start to act erratically, maybe compulsively checking their phone, constantly asking for reassurance, sulking like a child, or overreacting wildly to small things.
Yeah.
And then at just the right moment, when the person is most vulnerable, the seducer reappears. Not with stability, no, but with intermittent reward.
The reward.
Yeah, a sudden compliment out of the blue, an unexpected moment of intense intimacy, a brief flash of that withheld attention.
And this unpredictability, this push and pull, it sounds like it just traps someone deeper, doesn't it? Well, what's the ultimate cost of being caught in this kind of behavioral regression loop?
It absolutely traps them. This unpredictability deepens the regression. The target starts behaving more like a child desperately craving attention and approval than an adult navigating a relationship. Their boundaries begin to just crumble. Their behavior becomes compulsive. They might even become self-sabotaging or overly submissive just to keep that intermittent reward coming.
Oh, man.
And the seducer, chillingly, rewards and punishes them almost on cue, reinforcing the regression. Our sources call this psychological warfare disguised as romance.
Wow. Psychological warfare.
Yeah. And the warning here is profound. When someone starts to change their core behavior for you, becoming smaller, more reactive, more desperate, you are not seducing their true self. You are manipulating their fractures, their wounds. The danger is really twofold. You will likely become the object of their obsession and their resentment, often simultaneously. And perhaps even more tragically, you will dehumanize them and eventually yourself in the process. Behavioral regression traps both parties in a toxic dynamic where neither person is truly free or seen.
That's a truly chilling thought. The dehumanization inherent in, psychological warfare disguised as romance. It really makes you think about how some individuals might regress, not just emotionally or behaviorally, but in their entire approach to the wider world, like their responsibilities.
That leads us perfectly into the third type, social regression. This is essentially what we might call a flight from responsibility. This occurs when a person, usually under significant psychological strain, withdraws from their adult social roles and responsibilities.
So they just opt out.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
They revert to a more dependent or submissive position. They often express a desire for others to take care of them, or they really want to avoid making decisions altogether. It's fundamentally a surrender of their autonomy.
Why this particular form of regression, though? What makes someone who was perhaps once a very independent adult suddenly yearn to be taken care of or led?
Well, think about it. The burden of being an autonomous adult, the constant need to make choices, navigate complex social situations, deal with potential rejection, assert your independence day after day, it can be incredibly taxing for some people.
Yeah, adulting is hard sometimes.
It really is. And this burden can trigger old, often deep-seated fears of abandonment or failure. So, under stress, some individuals regress to a social state of dependency. There can be this secret, sometimes unconscious, craving to be led rather than to lead, to be sheltered or even controlled. They yearn for relief from what one of our sources actually calls the weight of freedom.
The weight of freedom, that's a really powerful phrase. Okay, so how does a seducer identify and then exploit this desire to surrender responsibility? How do they leverage that?
A truly skilled seducer, they don't just see who someone is in the present moment. They perceive who that person secretly longs to stop being. They sense this underlying exhaustion with adulthood, with responsibility.
They see the fatigue.
Exactly. And when they detect this desire for relief, the seducer steps in. But maybe not necessarily as a conventional lover, right? They might step in as a protector, a mentor, or even a dominant figure. They use authority, structure, and certainty as their primary tools of seduction. They present themselves as someone who knows better, someone who will make life infinitely easier if you just let them take the wheel.
So they offer safety through control.
Precisely. They might offer to take care of everything, subtly discourage your independence, or weave this narrative that the world is simply too harsh, too dangerous, and only they can provide true safety and security.
Okay, I can see how that would be appealing to someone feeling overwhelmed.
Absolutely. And the target then regresses socially. They become increasingly compliant, obedient, and often profoundly grateful for being dominated, for having that weight lifted. This is precisely where many toxic relationship dynamics begin. You see these submissive, seemingly devoted partners almost worshiping controlling lovers. This type of regression can even manifest in broader contexts, like cult-like scenarios with charismatic leaders or influencers.
Right, the dynamic isn't just romantic. It's hard to imagine giving up so much autonomy, though. What's the ultimate danger in this flight from responsibility when it's induced by a seducer?
Well, this form of seduction, while it might appear romantic or even comforting on the surface, the classic idea if he protects her or she needs him is, in truth, described by our sources as deeply parasitic.
Parasitic, wow.
Yeah. The danger is immense. One party effectively gives up their social autonomy, their agency in the world, in exchange for what feels like emotional survival. The seducer, often intoxicated by this level of control, may begin to genuinely believe they are owed obedience from the other person. It becomes an entitlement.
And the one being protected.
And the seduced, in turn, can become utterly terrified of ever leaving, of ever facing the world again, without their supposed protector. They feel incapable. This form of seduction doesn't just steal freedom, it steals dignity.
The theft of dignity. That's a truly chilling thought. It makes you wonder just how much of our core self can actually be eroded in these situations. Which brings us, I think, to the final form of regression. You identified one that seems maybe the most subtle and perhaps ultimately the most destructive.
Yes, this is identity regression, which we've called the return to a familiar mask, ICO. This happens when a person, usually under severe stress or maybe existential instability, abandons their mature, current self-concept and reverts to an earlier identity. This could be the rebellious teenager they once were, a lost child seeking guidance, the class clown deflecting with humor, or even a chronic people pleaser. It's not necessarily about becoming childish per se, but about retreating to an identity that feels familiar, something that once provided a sense of safety or power, even if it no longer truly serves them.
An old mask. That makes a lot of sense. Our adult identities are often so carefully cultivated, aren't they? So why do they crack under pressure like that? And why do we fall back on these older, maybe less developed versions of ourselves?
That's a great question. Our adult identities are like these refined masks, as you said, that we've carefully constructed and honed over years through experience and effort.
Mm-hmm.
But under intense pressure, things like deep fear, profound betrayal, maybe a crisis of meaning, that adult mask can crack. It feels too fragile, too exposed. When it does, people can instinctively fall back on older identities that, at some point in their past, help them feel seen or safe or powerful, even if in dysfunctional ways.
Like a default setting.
Exactly, like a psychological default setting. So a confident, accomplished woman might suddenly revert to being the insecure daddy's girl she thought she'd left behind. Or a composed, self-assured man might regress into the needy, insecure boy who constantly seeks female approval. Identity regression isn't always about being childish. It's about retreating to something familiar when the present feels too threatening.
Okay, that's clearer now. And how do manipulative seducers use this return to a familiar mask against someone? What's the strategy there? It seems so personal.
It is deeply personal. They exploit it by paying incredibly close attention to your emotional history, to your stories. They actively look for those old identities hiding just beneath the surface of your current one.
How do they find them?
They'll ask leading questions, often disguised as deep interest. Questions like, what were you really like in high school? Or were you the shy one? Or were you the troublemaker? Or even, very pointedly, who hurt you the most in your past?
Mining for data.
Essentially, yes, they're mapping your psychological terrain. And then, crucially, they seduce not the mature adult you are today, but the old identity they've unearthed. They might trigger the rebellious girl inside by romanticizing danger and rule-breaking, making her feel seen for that edge. Or they might trigger the obedient, approval-seeking boy by praising him lavishly for being such a good man, reinforcing that need.
So they validate the old self, not the current one.
Precisely. They reinforce the identity you've regressed into, because that identity, for them, is usually easier to understand, predict, and ultimately control. Once someone regresses to a previous version of themselves, their hard-won maturity, their boundaries, their self-awareness, all of it starts to erode. Seduction becomes terrifyingly easy when the target no longer truly sees who they are now, but only who they once were.
That's horrifying. The idea of someone literally like rewriting your selfhood without you realizing it. What makes this particular form of seductive manipulation the most lethal, as you put it?
Our research strongly suggests this is the most subtle and the most lethal form of seductive manipulation, precisely because it doesn't just distort your behavior or emotions, it rewrites selfhood. The immense danger here is that if someone claims to love you, but they love you not for who you are today with all your growth and complexity, but for a past mask you wore years ago, your true current self slowly begins to disappear. It gets starved of recognition.
You become invisible.
In a very real sense, yes. And when you fall in love with someone who actively encourages you to be less than who you are, to regress to an earlier, maybe simpler, but ultimately less evolved version of yourself, that's not love. It's not support. It's what our material chillingly calls psychological exile. It's weaponizing nostalgia, weaponizing past trauma, weaponizing ego, all tangled together to keep you trapped in the past.
Psychological exile. Wow, that brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to the overarching warning, tying all these, frankly, terrifying forms of regression together. This has been a truly illuminating, if, pretty unsettling deep dive.
It's heavy stuff, but it's important to remember, and seduction, when wielded darkly, as we've been discussing, offers that safety, but it's safety in the form of control. The seductive personality who masters these regression tactics essentially assumes very specific, very powerful roles in the target's life. They become a kind of parent to the emotionally regressed. They become the unpredictable reward giver to the behaviorally regressed. They become the all-knowing protector to the socially regressed. And perhaps most insidiously, they become a validating mirror to the identity regressed.
Playing God, almost, in a way. But this power, we have to remember, is always borrowed from someone else's suffering, someone else's vulnerability. And the cost for the seducer is exceptionally high, even if they don't see it initially. You might feel godlike, as you say, in your ability to influence others, but the more you rely on regression to seduce, the more you become hopelessly entangled in managing other people's wounds. You will eventually drown in their need, you might be devoured by their pain, and you will utterly lose the ability to relate to anyone authentically without manipulation, and eventually you will be left with only hollow power and absolutely no true intimacy. It's a lonely place.
A very high price. And for you, the listener, the one potentially being seduced through these means, the warnings need to be clear and direct.
Hmm.
So listen closely to these takeaways. If someone makes you feel incredibly emotionally safe, but also weirdly emotionally addicted, run.
Mm-hmm.
If someone seems to encourage your worst behaviors, your regressions, seemingly to keep you dependent or off balance, run.
Yeah.
If someone makes you feel like you genuinely cannot function socially or make decisions without them, run. Absolutely.
And crucially, if someone makes you fall in love with a version of yourself you thought or hoped you'd outgrown, run. Fast.
Because that's not love. That's regression-based seduction.
Mm.
And it always ends the same way
Yeah.
with the collapse of self for both people eventually.
Oh, okay. That was it. Yeah, a profoundly insightful yet absolutely vital deep dive. It's truly chilling to consider just how deeply these tactics can affect someone's selfhood, completely bypassing conscious thought and striking right at our most vulnerable, often unhealed parts. Understanding that crucial difference between genuine connection and insidious manipulation is, well, it's everything, isn't it?
It really is. And what's fascinating here, and maybe the final provocative thought from our research to leave you with, is this observation. The most dangerous seducers do not touch your body. They touch the part of you that stopped growing when you were hurt. And they make it feel loved until you are addicted.
Oof. That line will definitely stay with me. And it's a powerful challenge, I think, for you, our listener, to carry this awareness forward. What does this mean for how you observe your own emotional responses in relationships? How might this shape your understanding of others' behaviors, whether it's romantic, platonic, or even professional settings? We really encourage you to consider these insights as you navigate your own connections. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into what is undeniably a profoundly important, albeit cautionary topic. We hope you continue your own journey of understanding.